The 2022 Formula 1 season has just begun, and yet an epic title fight between Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc is already emerging. So in this video, let's explore how that fight is going to pan out and if anyone else can join in. Let's do this! So we are going to focus on Max Verstappen versus Charles Leclerc, as well as the machinery that they've got under them for the 2022 season. Then we are going to talk about the battles that they already had and a little bit of their history together. Let's start. So let's begin by comparing the Ferrari F175 to the Red Bull RB18. So as you may know, these cars follow two very different aerodynamic concepts, especially around the sidepod area. So whereas Ferrari has got by far the biggest sidepods in the grid with that very interesting top sculpted section, Red Bull actually got one of the smallest in the grid with that massive undercut effect and a little bit of a downwash effect combined. So these are two very different car concepts that work very differently in different areas of the track. So the Ferrari seems to work better with a race setup with a little bit more downforce than the Red Bull, which gives the Ferrari an advantage in the corners, whereas the Red Bull has a massive advantage in the straight. So that's why in Saudi Arabia you saw Max Verstappen get his advantage in Sector 2 and Sector 3 of the lap with those massive high-speed sections, and Charles Leclerc was much better in Sector 1. Now another very interesting characteristic from both of these cars that we are seeing after the first few races is that the Ferrari seems to be kinder on these tires and therefore seems to be better on the soft and medium tire, whereas the Red Bull has got an advantage on the hard tire. So this has a lot of strategic implications on how teams are going to run their race, because Ferrari may actually favor a strategy where they make more pit stops but stay on those softer tires, whereas Red Bull may favor one-stop strategies where they lose less time in the pits because they are able to work that hard tire better. Now this is very interesting to see because last year the hard tire was actually a weakness from Red Bull, so they seem to have fixed this and now they have an advantage at the latter stages of the race. Okay, but now let's actually talk about what you're all here for. Max Verstappen versus Charles Leclerc. So just like Lewis Hamilton versus Max Verstappen last year, we are in for an epic title fight, and just in the first two races we are seeing a lot of signs of what's to come. So unlike Max Verstappen versus Lewis Hamilton last year, we are seeing that these drivers are fighting with way more respect. So you may attribute this to a couple of reasons. So Charles Leclerc has always been a very smart driver, and Max Verstappen may not be fighting with as much pressure as last year, because unlike last year and unlike Charles, he doesn't have that pressure where he knows he might never become world champion because, well, he already is. And what this is doing to the racing is that it's reducing in much cleaner racing. So unlike what we saw last year with Lewis Hamilton and what we saw from Max in the previous years, he's not doing that kind of hard racing as much as he did with Lewis. So he's giving way more space to Charles, he's being way more respectful, and we aren't seeing as many of those crazy Max Verstappen classic dive bombs or pushing another driver off the track to gain an advantage. So this is a clear sign of things to come, and that the fighting this year is definitely going to be different from last year. But we need to caveat this by saying that these are only the first two races of the season, and that in the beginning of last season, when it was Max Verstappen against Lewis Hamilton, in the beginning the racing was also very clean, and it was only once the tension started to build up after a few crashes and once those championship points were becoming more and more valuable that things started heating up. So racing this year seems to be a little bit more fair, but not only that, it also seems to be way more smart. So the 2022 cars, unlike their 2021 predecessors, don't require the driver to make the dive bomb immediately once they can, because in 2021 and before, you really need to make the most of every overtaking opportunity because you didn't know when another one was going to come up. Whereas in 2022 with these new cars, drivers can follow and be confident that if they don't make the move this lap, they will be able to in the next lap. So we are seeing drivers fight in a whole new different way, and during these two races the main talking point has been the DRS line. So unlike what we thought was going to happen this year, DRS is actually more powerful than last year. And this is not because the rear wing opens more or because the cars are more dependent on DRS to pass. Actually no, actually the fact that DRS is more powerful is a very good sign for these regulations, because it means that drivers throughout the tight and twisty sections of the track are able to follow each other closely, which means that once they reach that DRS zone, DRS is very important because the cars are actually already very close together. So Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc have been fighting with this DRS line, and we saw two examples of this in the first two races of the season. So let's start by taking a look at Bahrain. So in this race, Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen fought for 3 laps in a row, and Charles Leclerc ended up winning, but the way in which he managed to stay in front Max Verstappen was very, very smart. Well, if you look at replays from inside the car, you see that in some situations in the main straight with Max Verstappen right behind him, Charles Leclerc didn't use 8th gear in the main straight. And what he wanted to do with this was make sure that he was behind Max going into the DRS detection point for the 2nd straight, because he was confident enough in his ability and in his car that he was going to get Max right back in the next straight and overtake him. And that's what Charles did, and that's what won him the race. So Charles actually, by being overtaken by Max and having that DRS in the critical point of the lap, managed to stay in front of Max and actually win that race. So it was immediately obvious that DRS games were going to be the way to go in 2022, but this was a very respectful fight, and at no point I thought that they were going to touch each other. And at Jeddah, the same thing actually happened, but in an even more dramatic way. So just like in Bahrain, Charles was trying to do the same thing. Once he noticed that Max was getting behind him on that 3rd DRS zone of the track, he actually wanted to back off in order for Max to cross the DRS detection zone in front of him in order for Charles to have the DRS and overtake Max right back. And he actually managed to do this in one occasion. But Max this time was actually aware of what Charles was trying to do, and he didn't make life as easy to Leclerc as he did in Bahrain. So this time Max also wanted to fight for this DRS line, and you saw this in two very good examples where Max was actually closing his DRS before he had to in order to make sure that Charles was actually passing on that line before him. And then we had the most dramatic example where no driver wanted to concede, and they ended up braking right before the DRS line in one of the most dramatic images from the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, where I thought that both drivers were actually going to crash. And this actually provided for a great moment in racing where we saw clearly what they wanted. None of them wanted to be the first to cross that DRS line. And in the end, Max Verstappen managed to get his way and Charles Leclerc crossed the DRS line first, and that's when Max Verstappen managed to do that overtake. So we are seeing a very, very interesting and tactical fight between these two drivers, and they are fighting in ways in which we haven't seen before. And this doesn't mean that racing isn't as hard as in previous years, it just means that drivers are fighting smarter because these new cars allow them to. But even though racing has been smarter and more respectful for the first two races of the season, we cannot forget that these drivers got history. So you remember back to Austria 2019 when Max Verstappen actually pulled off a move where he pushed Charles Leclerc right off the track and stole him the race win in the dying laps of that Grand Prix. But these drivers actually got way more history going back to their karting days, and you have surely seen that meme video from Charles and Max going around the internet over the last couple of days. So these drivers definitely got potential for the fight to get a little bit more ugly and for that respect to vanish as the season goes on. But for now what we are seeing is two amazing drivers fighting at the top of their game in a harder, smarter way than before. But finally, there's another detail that we need to talk about, and that's their teammates. So Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen have got very good teammates in each of their teams, in Sergio Perez and in Carlos Sainz. So we cannot forget that these two guys have the same car as Max and Charles, so they are very much in the championship fight. But I'm actually kind of worried for them. So both of these drivers have been performing very well, and poor Sergio in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix lost that win through no fault of his own, and if actually he managed to win, he would be ahead of Max in the championship. So we cannot discount both Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez for their championship, but I think that they are actually in the worst positions possible. When it comes to Ferrari and Red Bull, they are two of the teams that are most known on the grid for having a clear number one and number two driver structure. So this is the thing that worries me about them, because they have both been unlucky at times during the first two races, and even though Carlos Sainz managed to get on the podium in both races, he was right behind Charles, and Charles is actually gaining a lot of momentum because in the races it's always Charles fighting against Max, whereas Sainz is actually always fighting against Perez. I think that their teams are going to put all of their weight behind the driver that's scoring best after the first couple of races, and that's what worries me about Carlos and Sergio, because I think that if they don't perform well at Australia, and I think it's Imola after Australia, I think that they are going to lose that momentum and they are going to be relegated to that number two status. Now that's not what I want to see, because we clearly have potential in both of them. They are just taking a little bit more time than Max and Charles to get used to that car and to get the most performance out of it. So I really hope that they can do something special at Australia and at Imola and then Miami, because if they manage to score good points at the next couple of races, they are going to give Ferrari and Red Bull a very big headache in which driver to support for a title fight. And just a quick note, I think that there are a lot of drivers in the grid with potential to win that championship, but I think that even with teams like Mercedes, even if they are able to get on the same level as what Ferrari and Red Bull have right now, I think it will be a little bit too little too late to join the championship fight. So let me know in the comments down below who you think is going to be the champion this year. Will it be Charles, Max or anyone else? So with that said, that's been it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. You can check out my latest video right here or my latest live stream right here, and be sure to turn on those notifications to know every single time I go live after every single race weekend. So that's been it for this video. Thank you very much for watching once again, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye!